12 nuns entered. No bodies, no records, no explanation. The building still stands, tucked deep in the moss-choked hills of northern Massachusetts, where fog settles like judgment and the trees never seem to speak the same language twice. St. Cecilia's Convent, built in 1869 and shuttered 35 years later, is the kind of place maps stopped naming. A stone crucifix still hangs above the main entrance, cracked down the middle. But the bell tower, once the sound of hope for miles, is silent, and has been since 1904. That was the year the Vatican sealed the records and issued a rare edict of permanent closure. Not transfer, not reassignment, closure. It was as if the place had never existed. Parishioners were instructed to speak of it no more. Diocesan files were redacted, and visiting clergy were reassigned without explanation. In time, even the locals forgot what they were told to forget. But some didn't, and the ones who remembered whispered. They whispered about the 12 women who arrived in the spring of 1902. 12 sisters, sent from different parts of New England, some young, just after novitiate, others seasoned, transferred without warning from convents with long histories. All were welcomed under the new Mother Superior, an elusive woman named Sister Apollonia. No photo of her has ever surfaced. No birth record, no profession of vows, but her signature appears in the convent's guest book, 6 times over 3 years, written always in violet ink. Locals say that during those years the lights at St. Cecilia's burned long past midnight. Carriages would arrive at odd hours, leaving before dawn. The chapel's stained glass windows, once known for their brilliant depictions of the Annunciation, were covered from the inside with heavy cloth. Travelers from the nearby rail stop reported hearing organ music long after the sisters should have been asleep. Some even claimed they heard screaming, but when questioned, they amended it to singing, because that was easier to explain. There was one man who spoke too freely, Thomas Albright, the groundskeeper's son. In 1903, at just 19, he told a local barkeep that he'd seen women dragged into the cellars beneath the convent, alive, but never saw them come out. He said there were noises beneath the floors, medical smells that didn't belong in a chapel. His father was fired a week later. Thomas was found hanging from a tree 3 months after that. Ruled a suicide. The barkeep, when questioned, claimed he never spoke to the boy. By the fall of 1904, St. Cecilia's had gone silent. No letters, no requests for food or ink or coal for the fires. The diocese sent a courier. He returned within the day, pale and wordless. That Sunday, Mass included a strange request. The congregation was to pray for the peaceful resolution of internal matters at the convent. No further explanation was offered, but behind closed doors, the Vatican launched a private inquiry. Led by Monsignor Victor Lantry, a man known for rooting out doctrinal deviations in Eastern Europe. He arrived under cover of darkness with 2 assistants and a sealed brief. They stayed 3 nights, and on the morning of the 4th, they left. No report was filed, no public statement issued. One of his assistants later broke silence in a confessional, according to a journal found years later in a Jesuit library. He claimed what they saw violated not only canon law, but the laws of nature and memory. The man who wrote the journal was reassigned to a monastery in Sicily. He died 5 years later from what was officially called neurological exhaustion. After the investigation, the Vatican ordered St. Cecilia's permanently closed. A rare decree known as a silentum perpetuum was issued, forbidding clergy from discussing the convent under pain of excommunication. The grounds were sold in 1911 to a private family under a different name. Within a year, they left. Neighbors reported the woman of the house began speaking in tongues no one recognized. She was committed to Danvers State Hospital and died 3 months later. Her husband vanished. Their 2 children were taken in by relatives and refused, for the rest of their lives, to speak of their time at the house. To this day, there are no public records of where the 12 sisters went. No obituaries, no transfer logs, no final vows. Even their baptismal records have vanished from diocesan archives. So what happened? Was it a case of mass hysteria, cultic deviation, or something more calculated? There are fragments, pieces of correspondence found in estate sales and archives, a scorched page from a diary mentioning the doctrine of erasure, a faded photograph of 9 veiled women standing in the convent courtyard, their faces turned just slightly away from the camera, an invoice from a Boston medical supplier for cognitive alignment straps and cranial calipers, addressed to a false name tied to St. Cecilia's post office box. These artifacts were collected in the 1970s by a retired professor named Edwin Mallory, who tried to publish his findings. He died before the manuscript was finished. Stroke, they said. His notes were confiscated by his university at the request of unnamed legal authorities. What survives is what the institution tried to bury. A single envelope, mailed anonymously to a journalist in 1994, contained a copy of the convent's final guest registry. The last name listed, Sister Mercy Duval, arrived October 2, 1904. No departure date listed. She was the last to walk through those stone doors. And according to a letter that surfaced years later, she was already suspicious before she arrived. What did she see inside? Why did the Vatican seal everything? And why, more than a century later, do locals still swear they hear the chapel bell ring once at midnight on the anniversary of the convent's closure? This is the story of St. Cecilia's, but more importantly, it's the story of the women who were erased. Under the cold autumn rain of 1899, Sister Mercy Duval stepped down from the rusted carriage that had carried her north from Boston. Her shoes sank slightly into the moss-lined stones of St. Cecilia's courtyard. The air smelled of pine, stone, and something faintly chemical, like sulfur or bleach. The convent loomed ahead, taller than she'd imagined, with narrow windows that seemed too high for any mortal gaze. The sisters inside did not wave, did not smile. They only watched from behind fogged glass. Mercy clutched her satchel tightly, her knuckles white. She had arrived, yes, but not willingly. Her transfer had come as a surprise. One moment she was helping at an orphanage in Dorchester, tending to children with fevered skin and fractured minds. The next, she was summoned by her diocese, handed a sealed letter, and told to pack. She wasn't being punished, they said, just reassigned. A higher calling. But no one would explain what was happening at St. Cecilia's. Only that obedience is a form of salvation. The front doors creaked open as she approached. Standing in the entryway was Mother Apollonia. She was not what Mercy expected. No soft eyes, no kindly presence. She was rail-thin and upright, wearing a veil so tight it obscured her ears entirely. Her hands were folded in front of her, not in greeting, but like a locked gate. Her face was pale, her lips tight, her gaze clinical, the kind of woman who seemed to measure a person's worth in silence. "You are late," Apollonia said. No welcome, no blessing, just observation. There was flooding along the, "You will address me as Mother." Sister Mercy nodded, eyes lowered. "Yes, Mother." They passed through stone corridors lined with faded icons and crucifixes that seemed too tarnished to have been kissed. The floor was so clean it almost gleamed, and yet the convent smelled not of incense or warmth, but of antiseptic. Every few steps they passed a statue whose face had been scratched or defaced. Not vandalism, but almost as if deliberately weathered. "You were a teacher, yes?" the mother asked. And a nurse, briefly, during the fever outbreak. And confessor? Only among the sick, when no priest was present. Apollonia nodded once, but said nothing more. She stopped before a narrow door marked simply with a cross carved into wood. The hallway here dipped slightly downward, and the air was colder. A faint hum, electrical or perhaps mechanical, vibrated through the stone. "This will be your post," Apollonia said. Sister Mercy frowned. "Isn't this the lower wing? I was told it was under renovation." "Renovation has ended. You are needed here." Her voice held finality like a slammed door. "Meals are silent. Chapel begins at 4. Obedience is the first language of heaven." Then she left. The door creaked open without effort. Inside was a sparse single room. Cot, basin, small crucifix above the bed. But it wasn't the room that unsettled her. It was the hallway beyond it, an extension of the lower wing. She could see it through the slatted vent near her bed, a long corridor lined with heavy doors, each with a sliding metal panel near the center, like confessional grates. But they didn't seem made for confession. They seemed made for watching. That night, she met the other sisters during evening prayers. None of them spoke, not even in hushed greetings. They moved in choreographed silence, heads bowed, eyes low. Even when one tripped on the altar steps, she did not gasp or cry out. The only one who spoke was Apollonia, reading from a strange devotional that Mercy had never heard before, passages that referenced cleansing the inner word and separating the soul from the disobedient self. The theology felt off, cold, like scripture written by a surgeon. After prayers, she tried to speak to one of the younger sisters, Sister Alina, perhaps 17, with trembling fingers and bruised-looking eyes. But the girl only offered a quick glance, a slight shake of the head, and then walked quickly away, clutching her rosary like a weapon. Whispers began that night. At first, Mercy thought they were dreams, low mutterings beyond her vent, like prayers spoken in reverse. But when she rose and placed her ear to the metal grate, she could hear them more clearly. Phrases, repetitions. "Not I, not I, not I," said again and again. The voice didn't sound frightened. It sounded mechanical, like someone trying to remember a language they were being forced to forget. The next day, she wandered the convent corridors between chapel and meal. It was then she noticed the markings, behind tapestries, scratched beneath window frames. Little sigils, circular, like labyrinths, always paired with a number. Room 3 bore the symbol for infinity. Room 7 had none at all. When she asked about them, the other sisters turned away. Only one, Sister Therese, older, perhaps 50, gave her a look. Not of warning, of regret. At dinner, she tried again to speak. "Mother, might I inquire about the lower wing's purpose?" Apollonia did not look up from her bread. "Your purpose is obedience, not inquiry. But you may sleep elsewhere if the wing displeases you." She looked up now. "We have open beds, beneath." That word, beneath. Sister Mercy spent the night in her room, wide awake, candle burning low. The hum from the hallway grew louder after midnight. Once she thought she heard the metallic slide of a grate, then a muffled cry. Then silence. By morning, the air smelled faintly of blood and lavender. On the third day, she was given her formal duties. She was to assist in mental sanitation for the wayward sisters, those whose thoughts strayed from the rule. It was phrased so casually, like sweeping a floor. "But I am not trained in sanitation." "You are trained in compassion," said Apollonia. "That is sufficient." Her duties began in the west corridor. She was handed a ledger with the names of 3 sisters and a schedule. Each was listed under a heading, Cleansing, Stage 2. No other details. She never saw the sisters themselves, only notes left outside their doors. Instructions, scripture passages, temperature logs. It didn't feel like ministry, it felt like preparation. That night, her candle flickered low as she sat on her bed holding the ledger. Behind her, the hallway vent rattled once, then again. She turned toward it slowly, and something, on the other side whispered her name. Just once. Barely audible, but enough to freeze her blood. She no longer questioned whether she belonged here. The question now was why she was sent. It was on her 7th day inside the stone womb of St. Cecilia's that Sister Mercy realized the silence wasn't just discipline, it was doctrine. Not the familiar monastic quiet that softened the soul, but a calcified, punitive kind. A silence that reached inward and clawed out identity by the root. During morning devotions, she noticed something subtle yet deeply wrong. The sisters didn't bow their heads in prayer. They froze, statue still, as if waiting for a command that never came. Their mouths moved, yes, but not to whisper psalms or sacred words. Instead, they mouthed single syllables inaudibly, like broken phonographs attempting to restart. She watched Sister Alina closely. The girl's lips formed the word before, again and again. Before, before, before. Her hands trembled on her rosary like it burned her fingers. That evening, Mercy was summoned to a small room near the chapel. Inside was a narrow writing desk, a chair, and 2 candles. A sheet of paper lay on the desk with a single line written in ink. "What did you think today that displeased heaven?" Mother Apollonia appeared behind her without a sound. "Confession," she said. "Not spoken, transcribed." "But I've already confessed. This is the only confession that matters." She placed a second sheet of paper next to the first. "Thought is where sin begins." Mercy stared down at the blank page. "And if I have no sinful thoughts?" Apollonia's smile was a thin cut across her face. Then right, "I am no longer I." She left the room. Mercy wrote nothing. She waited an hour, then returned the page blank. That night, her mattress was removed, her chamber pot replaced with a rusted bucket. Her candle was taken. The next day, Sister Alina avoided her completely. The following week revealed more of the convent's rules. Each sister had a personal journal, but it was not private. Every night after Vespers, the journals were placed in a locked box outside each room. In the morning, they returned, many with corrections in red ink, sentences crossed out, whole pages ripped. Some journals grew thinner by the day. Mercy tried writing nothing. Her journal was returned with a single note. Obedience requires transparency. So she wrote innocuous things, meals, chores, prayers. But that too was not enough. Her next journal returned with a line underlined in red. Thoughts unspoken rot the soul. From then on, she noticed how the other sisters walked with heads slightly tilted, as if listening for a frequency only they could hear. Sister Therese began writing her journal entries with her eyes closed. Sister Ruth, once warm and maternal, stopped responding to her name altogether. Punishment at St. Cecilia's didn't come with lashes or public humiliation. It came in the form of confinement and correction. The term passed between lips like a sacrament. Sister Hannah was the first Mercy saw taken. During morning cleaning, she dropped a chalice in the chapel. It shattered. No words were spoken, but 2 other sisters, Sister Judith and Sister Elspeth, stood, took her arms, and walked her down the hall to the lower wing. She did not struggle. She only whispered a prayer that ended with the words, "Make me small." 3 days later, she returned. changed. Her walk was slower, her gaze unblinking. She no longer blinked at candlelight or startled when others passed. At dinner, she reached for her spoon with the wrong hand and didn't seem to notice. When Mercy asked her how she was, Sister Hannah responded with a line of scripture, flat and toneless. "I have crucified the flesh with its passions," and nothing more. That night, Mercy could not sleep. The hum beneath her floor was stronger than ever. The candlelight flickered not from a breeze, but from something beneath. A vibration, a pulse. She knelt to pray, to think, to remember herself, and that was when she saw it. A torn page tucked between the stone seam and the frame of her bed. Yellowed, folded twice, written in slanted, trembling ink. "They are taking names. I've lost mine. I think I was Eleanor. They say I was always Ruth, but I know that's not true. Ruth was the sister who burned her hands trying to climb the fence. I remember her, I remember me. But I am told remembering is pride, and pride is a wound, and wounds must be opened. God forgive me. I wrote this with my teeth." The paper bore bite marks. Mercy folded it carefully and placed it beneath the sole of her shoe. Her heart beat so loud she was sure it echoed. She had to know more. That night, she left her room after curfew. The halls of St. Cecilia's were never truly dark. Lanterns flickered faintly behind frosted glass. Statues watched her pass, eyes hollow, hands folded in grim submission. She moved silently toward the infirmary, where she believed Sister Hannah had been taken. The door was locked, but near it stood a cart of supplies, bandages, antiseptic, gloves, and a file. It bore no name, only a number, subject 41B. Inside, notes. Verbal correction insufficient. Delusions of autonomy persist. Recommend neural quieting. Observed resisting identification. Refers to previous self as Anna. No record of that name exists. Proceed with Phase 2. Erasure protocol approved. Mercy took a trembling step backward. Her mouth went dry. Footsteps echoed nearby. She turned and slipped into a small linen closet, heart pounding. From the slats in the door, she saw Sister Judith pass by. Behind her, a second nun wheeled a small cart covered in a white sheet. A hand dangled from beneath it. Still, pale. The cart turned the corner and vanished down the lower hallway. When she returned to her room, Mercy placed the torn page from Eleanor into her journal, hidden between two blank pages. She wrote nothing that night, but the next morning, her journal was gone. Replaced with a new one, thinner, lighter. Inside the front page, a note written in violet ink. "We have removed the parts that were hurting you." Mercy sat in her cot for hours, unmoving. They were not cleansing sin, they were cleansing memory, identity, thought itself. And the sisters were not resisting, they were becoming. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet know, was that her own name appeared in the ledger outside the infirmary. Written in block letters. Mercy Duval. Phase 1, observation complete. Phase 2, initiate correction. It was a Thursday when Sister Mercy finally broke. The pattern had become unbearable. Muffled whispers in the stone, veiled warnings tucked into routine, and a silence that devoured more than sound. Each morning, another sister moved slower, forgot her name, stared longer into nothing. And every evening, the journal collectors came, hollow-eyed, hands gloved not for cleanliness, but for ritual. That night, something shifted. It was subtle, a metallic click in the hallway after curfew. The door to the west wing, normally sealed with chains and a brass lock, groaned slightly open. Mercy sat upright in her cot, the crucifix above her casting a warped shadow along the wall. She slipped on her shoes, tucked the page from Eleanor, now her only tether to reality, into her sleeve, and crept into the hall. The wind outside rattled the stained glass windows, but inside, the air was perfectly still. Down the corridor, two sisters emerged from a prayer room Mercy had never been permitted to enter. One carried a lantern. The other pushed a narrow cart covered in cloth, the same kind she'd seen outside the infirmary. She followed them, step by careful step, always just out of sight, watching the way their shadows stretched unnaturally along the corridor's wet stone walls. The air grew colder with each turn. They passed the kitchen, the library, and the old stairwell that spiraled down beneath the convent, down to where the stone changed texture and the air smelled of rust and lye. At the end of the stairwell, one sister pulled a key from around her neck. She turned it slowly in a door, with no sign, no markings, nothing to indicate what lay beyond. A heavy clank echoed through the stone, and the door swung open on silent hinges. The two sisters disappeared inside. The door began to close. Mercy sprinted forward and wedged her hand between the door and the frame. Pain bloomed in her knuckles, but she didn't flinch. She pulled it open just enough to slip through, then let it seal behind her. She stood in absolute darkness. Then, click, a light flickered overhead. She was in a narrow tunnel. The ceiling arched low, the walls lined with rusted sconces and symbols etched into plaster. Not crosses, something more geometric, cold logic and design. The tunnel sloped downward. She walked. The hum she'd heard for nights grew louder with each step, a mechanical resonance, not unlike the low drone of a tuning fork pressed against bone. Ahead, pale yellow light spilled from beneath a door left ajar. Voices, faint, repetitive. She inched closer and peeked through the crack. It was a chamber, not a cell, not a room, a chamber, wide and circular, carved from the natural stone like a crypt. Along the far wall, 3 surgical chairs reclined beneath a network of hanging instruments. Tubes, hooks, wires. Beside them, a cabinet of small jars, labeled in Latin, spiritus, animus, motus, something viscous inside each. There were restraints on the chairs, brown with dried blood. A tray with bone saws and scalpels sat soaking in a basin of pink water. In the center of the room stood Mother Apollonia, her veil removed. Her head was shaved, her eyes dark hollows of devotion. She stood over a young woman who sat in one of the chairs, arms bound, eyes wild. Sister Alina. Mercy covered her mouth. The girl's wrists were bruised, and her mouth had been stitched shut, not with thread, but with fine wire. Apollonia whispered something to the assistant. The assistant flipped a switch. A low hum filled the room, stronger now. Alina began to convulse. Her eyes rolled back. Her legs kicked once, twice, then went still. A second assistant opened a drawer and removed a slip of paper. She handed it to Apollonia, who nodded. "She is Ruth now," the mother said. Mercy gasped. The assistant turned. A moment of frozen time, then chaos. The 2 assistants lunged toward the door. Mercy turned and bolted back through the tunnel, sprinting up the incline, feet slipping on the damp stone. She hit the staircase, grabbed the railing, and pulled herself upward in a panic. She didn't stop until she reached the chapel and collapsed behind a pew, her lungs burning, heart slamming against her ribs like a warning bell. She waited there in silence for hours. No one came. No alarm sounded. No search parties. No questions. By sunrise, she slipped back to her quarters. The candle by her bed had burned to a stub. Her journal was in its usual place. She waited for the knock. None came. At breakfast, no one stared. No one avoided her. Sister Judith passed the bread as usual. Sister Elspeth made the sign of the cross. Even Sister Alina, eyes vacant, lips no longer wired, sat across from her chewing her porridge in silence. No limp, no bruises. Her hands were steady. But her gaze, it was empty, as if the girl who had trembled under the weight of her own prayers had been replaced by a machine. Mercy tried to speak to her after the meal. "Alina." The girl turned, head tilted. "I am Ruth." Not defiant, not confused, just fact. Later that day, as Mercy cleaned the hallway near the chapel, she found something wedged beneath the radiator. A thin metal tag on a frayed ribbon. She turned it over. Sister Magdalene, removed. The word wasn't transferred, not departed, not deceased. Removed. She clutched the tag and stared down the hallway toward the lower wing. The door at the end was closed again, sealed with brass. But now she understood what lay behind it. The midnight room was real. It was where names died, where minds were peeled apart like fruit, where silence wasn't holy but harvested. And she knew now, with a dread so complete it felt like drowning, that her name was next. The convent had no formal library, no warm nook of creaking floorboards and forgotten parchment, only the archive. It sat at the base of the bell tower, behind a rusted iron door with no keyhole, just a sliding bolt that clanged like judgment when opened. Sister Mercy had never been assigned to the archive. Few were. Only senior nuns with administrative duties, as Mother Apollonia called them. But when Sister Therese fell ill with mental fatigue, Mercy was given her task for the week, inventorying old sacramental records. "Be exact," Apollonia said, handing her a brass lamp and a ring of keys. "Mistakes are remembered longer than names." The archive was colder than any other room in the convent. Dust, thick as ash, hung in the air. Rows upon rows of iron shelves stretched towards the ceiling, sagging under the weight of leather-bound ledgers. Baptisms, deaths, transfers, prayer rosters. Some volumes bore dates from over a century ago. Many were unlabeled, their spines cracked and bleeding glue. She worked in silence, until she found it. At the back of the third row, hidden behind a false panel marked Canticles, 1850, she noticed something off. A seam in the wood, too precise to be decay. She pushed against it. With a soft click, the panel popped loose. Behind it, a black box with an ornate lock, cold to the touch. One of her keys fit perfectly. Inside was a book, bound in what felt like skin, too soft for leather, too warm for paper. A single phrase etched on the cover in fading ink: Liber Oblivionis, the Book of Forgetting. She opened it, page after page of names, each line written in the same violet ink as Apollonia's signature. No last names, just titles and dates. Sister Helena, 14 Jan, 1886, Memoria Redacta. Sister Agnes, 23. Mar, 1887, Memoria Redacta. Sister Clare, 07, Nov, 1888, Memoria Redacta. There were hundreds, each name followed by a date, then always, Memoria Redacta. Mercy stared at the Latin phrase. She had studied enough theology to understand. Memory redacted, but not just forgotten. Intentionally wiped, as if memory itself was considered a disease. Her eyes scanned the dates. A pattern emerged, every month, sometimes twice, like a harvest. She flipped to the final page. Sister Magdalene, 06 Sep 1819, Memoria Redacta. Sister Ruth, 14. Octi, 1899, Memoria Redacta. Sister Mercy. The line was blank, but the space was there, waiting. A name pre-written, only the date missing. She felt the breath leave her lungs. She slammed the book shut, returned it to the box, and slid the panel back into place. Her hands trembled as she backed away. She hadn't noticed the flickering lantern by the door until it moved, until a voice broke the silence behind her. Found something useful. Sister Judith. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were empty. "No," Mercy said quickly. "Just records." Judith nodded slowly. "Be sure not to misfile them. Some entries. Resist being forgotten." She left without another word. Mercy clutched the brass lamp and fled the archive. That night, she wrote nothing in her journal. She no longer trusted the page. Instead, she scratched notes on the inside of her robes with charcoal. She memorized names from the book, dates. She repeated them like prayers, like proof that she still knew who she was. The following morning, a carriage arrived. Unusual. Deliveries were made once a month and always by foot. Mother Apollonia emerged from the convent entrance, her veil catching the wind like a shroud. The door opened and a young woman stepped down. 18, maybe. Wide eyes. Pale knuckles gripping her rosary like it was all she had left. Her habit was freshly pressed, her shoes clean. A new arrival, her name, whispered between sisters, spread like smoke. Sister Veronica, assigned to the lower wing. The pattern had begun again. Mercy watched from the upper window as Apollonia led her inside, hand resting on the girl's shoulder like a priest guiding a lamb to the altar. That night, Mercy found the courage to return to the archive. She waited until the convent slept, until even the hum of the underground machines had quieted to a dull heartbeat. With her lamp tucked beneath her cloak, she crept past the chapel, through the infirmary corridor, and up into the bell tower's base. The door creaked open like a coffin lid. Inside, the darkness swallowed everything. But she moved with purpose now. She found the panel, opened the box. The book was still there. She turned to the final page. Sister Veronica, O 2 Nov. 1899, Memoria Redacta. The date was tomorrow. She staggered back, dropped the lamp, caught it before it shattered. She stared at the entry. Ink still drying. They had already written her fate, before she had spoken, before she had sinned. This wasn't punishment, it was ritual. She returned to her room before dawn, unable to sleep, unable to pray. The next morning, Sister Veronica was not at breakfast. No one mentioned her name. Mercy went to the chapel. The pew where Veronica had sat just once, gone, removed, as if it had never been there. Her journal slot outside the door, empty. Her bedding changed. Every trace erased. She approached Sister Therese. "Veronica," she whispered. "Where is she?" Therese blinked, confused. "Who?" Mercy's throat tightened. "The new girl." There was no new girl. She turned and walked away. Mercy felt a coldness settle inside her chest, deeper than fear. They were not just cleansing behavior. They were unmaking people. Erasing not just minds, but history, presence, evidence. She returned to the archive one final time that night. Not to read. To write. On the final page of the Liber Oblivionis, beneath her own name, beneath the space they'd left for her, she carved 5 words into the parchment with a sewing needle dipped in blood. "I remember. I will resist." She placed the book back in its box. But she knew now, time was running out. The ledger did not make predictions. It made appointments. The chapel had always unsettled Mercy, not because it was unholy, but because it felt too perfect. Every bench evenly spaced, every statue unblemished, every candle replaced before it could burn low. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a stage set for obedience. She had prayed there every morning since arriving at St. Cecilia's. But on this morning, her prayers turned to searching. She needed answers no crucifix could give. The statue of St. Dymphna had always drawn her eye. A saint of mental affliction, oddly fitting for a place that specialized in reshaping minds. Mercy knelt before it and tilted her head. Something was off. The base was dustless as if recently handled. She reached behind the carved robes and felt a faint groove. Wood, not stone. Her fingers pressed inward. A faint click. The front of the statue creaked open like a confessional door. Inside was a hollow cavity, and inside that, a small, leather-bound journal. She took it, closed the statue, slipped away unnoticed. Back in her quarters, she lit a candle and opened the cover. Mother Agnes Belrose, Confessions, begin 1891. The handwriting was sharp and angular, the ink faded but legible. The first few pages were mundane: inventory lists, novitiate reports, references to Apollonia as a capable but zealous understudy. But then came the entries that didn't belong in any convent record. Procedure number 17, subject, Sister Clarice, vocal dissociation complete, responds to trigger phrases, retains basic motor skills, no recollection of name or family. Procedure number 23, subject, Mary Ellen, external, unresponsive post-cleansing, placed in dormitory as passive subject, no memory of arrival. Mercy's hands began to tremble as she flipped the pages. There were diagrams, notes on cranial incisions, syringe volumes, Latin phrases, oblivionem mentis, corpus in obedientia. And then came something different, a shift in tone, personal, desperate. I was promised healing, that we would cure despair, hysteria, melancholy. But what we created is not correction, it is subtraction. Each success is an absence, each cleanse a disappearance. They stop praying after the procedure, not because they lose faith, but because they lose the idea of prayer. The soul unspools from the body like thread, and there is no way to stitch it back. Sister Magdalene walked into the chapel last night, stared at the crucifix for 2 hours, not in devotion, in confusion. She touched her own face like she didn't know what it was. Mercy swallowed. Magdalene, the name tag she'd found. Her removal wasn't disciplinary. It was transformation. The final pages of the journal were stained with wax, the ink smudged. Apollonia believes she's completing my work, but she never saw the results, never heard the screams that became moans, then silence, never looked into the eyes of a woman who forgot her own child. They believe they are instruments of God, but we are physicians of forgetting, and our scalpel is obedience. And the final line, it is not silence we are teaching, it is death. Mercy stared at the page for a long time. It felt like the final confession of someone who had died long before her body gave out. She didn't know what happened to Mother Agnes Belrose. No one mentioned her name. Apollonia referred to her only once, as the predecessor whose methods required refinement. Now Mercy understood why. That night, she didn't sleep. She paced, recited names, dates, the ledger, the book of forgetting. Eleanor's note, Magdalene's tag, Veronica's scheduled erasure, the journal in her lap. It all fit together into one horrifying design. They weren't removing sin. They were removing selves. By morning, the journal was gone. Not misplaced, not hidden, gone. She tore through her mattress, her floorboards, the lining of her robes. She confronted Sister Judith, who smiled and said, "Sometimes confession is its own penance." At breakfast, Mother Apollonia made an announcement. "A new postulant arrives tonight," she said. "Her family reports dangerous impulses. We shall restore her grace." Mercy didn't hear the name. She only heard the silence in the room, the agreement, the complicity. They would do it again and again, until no one remained who remembered. She returned to the chapel, lit every candle, sat beneath the statue of St. Dymphna with her arms wrapped around herself. She thought of Agnes Belrose, of her handwriting growing shaky, of her final words, and she wondered, how far does silence echo before it becomes permanent? Then a thought came to her, slow and sharp. If they were rewriting women, then somewhere in the convent, they must have kept the drafts. Not just the ledger, not just the names, but the memories. And if they had them, somewhere, she would find them. And if she couldn't save herself, she would save the evidence. Sister Mercy learned quickly that survival required performance. She began speaking less, praying more, bowing her head at every opportunity. She copied the vacant expressions of the other sisters. She even began to answer to Ruth when addressed by mistake, though every time she did, a part of her felt buried alive. Her obedience was an act, but it worked. 2 weeks after discovering Mother Agnes's journal, Mercy was summoned to the lower wing, not for punishment, but for service. "Apollonia sees promise in you," Sister Judith told her, leading her through the corridor that once vibrated with screams. "Your clarity of purpose makes you ideal for intake assistance." Intake. She nodded. "Thank you. I wish to be useful." Judith smiled, the corners of her mouth too sharp to be kind. "You already are." The surgical wing was not what she expected. It was quieter, colder. Every footstep was muffled, as though the walls themselves had been padded to hide the sounds of regret. Stainless steel tables gleamed under flickering lights. Shelves overflowed with labeled jars, formalin, tinctures, brain matter suspended in amber liquid like relics of forgotten saints. Mercy kept her eyes open, but her heart hidden. They had her clean the instruments, file the reports, assist with preparations. She saw everything, but pretended to see nothing. Every night, she returned to the chapel with a small scrap tucked in her sleeve. A page from the book of erasures, a discarded journal entry, a surgical sketch. She pried up a loose floorboard beneath the statue of St. Dymphna and slid the evidence into the dark. Paper upon paper, names upon names. She was building a memory the convent could not burn. But she needed help. The visiting priest arrived 2 Fridays later. Father Albin, a thin, pale man from Rome with shaking hands and eyes that never rested in one place for long. He came twice a year to hear confessions and review ecclesiastical records. The sisters revered him. Mercy saw only weakness. She waited until the end of his visit. As he prepared to leave, she intercepted him in the chapel. "Father," she whispered, kneeling beside him, "there is something wrong here." He looked at her, surprised, cautious. "Sister?" "Mercy Duval." She pulled a folded paper from her sleeve and placed it in his hand. A page from the surgical log, dated 2 days prior, subject 45C. Name unknown. Arrived comatose. Eye movement restored, but language centers removed. Result, docile. "Please," she said, voice cracking. "This is not a convent, it's a laboratory." He stared at the paper, then at her. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I've collected more. Beneath St. Dymphna, I'll show you." "Not here," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Tonight, midnight, in the bell tower stair." She nodded. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight in her chest lift. Someone believed her. At midnight, she waited in the stairwell for 2 hours. Father Albin never came. The next morning, his carriage remained in the courtyard, but he was gone. When Mercy asked Sister Elspeth, the answer was simple. He returned to Rome early. When she checked the chapel, the floorboards beneath St. Dymphna had been nailed shut. Every page, every name, gone. Panic crawled up her throat. She had nothing now, nothing but memory. But even that, she realized, was fragile. One night, one injection, one confession. That was all it would take. She returned to the surgical wing, head bowed, hands obedient. She waited for her moment, and it came. During intake, a young girl, no more than 15, was brought in. Her name was Lillian. She had refused an arranged marriage and was sent by her family for moral refinement. As they prepped her for evaluation, Mercy watched the girl's lips move in silent prayer. They strapped her down. Sister Judith read from a clipboard. Subject 47A. Literacy, advanced. Social defiance, high. Procedure recommendation, moderate memory reduction. Mercy stepped forward. "Permission to offer prayer before the cleanse," she said. Judith raised an eyebrow. Apollonia, observing from the gallery, nodded. Briefly. Mercy leaned close to Lillian. "Listen," she whispered. "I'm going to help you, but you must pretend. Can you do that?" Tears streamed down the girl's cheeks. She gave the slightest nod. Mercy turned back to the instruments, heart hammering. She needed a plan. She needed time. She needed one final chance to save them both. The storm broke just after Vespers. Thunder cracked across the sky like a gavel. Rain fell in thick sheets, drowning out even the whispers that haunted the convent walls. To the Sisters of St. Cecilia's, it was a cleansing, a ritual reminder of obedience. To Mercy, it was cover. She had spent 3 days stealing what she could: keys from sleeping sisters, matches from the kitchen, scraps of paper from the surgical wing. She had watched the routines, memorized the night patrol, noted when Judith dozed during adoration, and when the gates were unlatched for deliveries. She knew she wouldn't get another chance. So she waited until midnight. Then, while the storm howled and most of the convent was gathered in the chapel for forced vigils, Mercy crept into the administrative hall. The wing where the medical records were kept, where the cleansings were logged, and where every stolen soul had been reduced to Latin phrases in ink. She unlocked the storage room. It reeked of antiseptic and old parchment. Files stretched wall to wall, ledgers, procedure notes, intake forms, behavior reports. She struck the first match with trembling fingers. The paper caught fast, too fast. The flame leapt up the shelves like it had been waiting, eager to devour the evidence. She dropped the matchbox and ran. Smoke filled the corridor in seconds. Alarms didn't exist in St. Cecilia's, too modern, too noisy, but the bells in the bell tower began to toll, a dull and eerie knell of rising panic. Screams erupted. Sisters ran through the halls in blind confusion, some clutching rosaries, others trying to form lines and fail-safe prayers. But Mercy didn't join them. She turned left, into the old west corridor, abandoned, sealed off for decades, or so they claimed. She used the ring of stolen keys to open the rusted door. The hinges groaned like a dying throat. Inside, the air was thick and warm, smelling of copper and something worse. It wasn't a hallway, it was a tunnel. She stepped forward, the smoke from the main wing curling behind her like a tale of guilt. At the end of the tunnel was a room, a place she had only glimpsed in Eleanor's note and Agnes's journal. The forgotten ward. 2 metal cells stood side by side, sunken into the floor like cages for animals. In each, a woman sat slumped against the wall. Not dead, but not alive. Their habits were faded, their skin pale as paper. Eyes wide open but unfocused, like dolls whose strings had been cut. One of them had hair missing in patches. The other rocked gently, humming the first few notes of Ave Maria, then stopping, then starting again. Mercy dropped to her knees beside the bars. "Sisters," she whispered, "I know you're in there. I know they took something from you, but you're not gone." No response. She reached through the bars and touched the hand of the closer woman. It twitched. A tear slipped down her cheek. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner." A crash echoed behind her, boots on stone. Shouts. They knew. She grabbed a scalpel from the nearby tray, always a tray, and sliced through the old leather belts holding the cages shut. The locks crumbled. She dragged the first woman out, then the second. They didn't resist, but they didn't walk. She couldn't carry them. She had to choose. "I'll come back," she promised the second woman, laying her gently down. "I swear to you." She threw the woman's rosary around her own neck and half dragged, half carried the other through the tunnel toward the eastern chapel entrance. Flames licked the ceiling above. Smoke burned her eyes. She burst through the garden arch and stumbled into the woods, branches whipping her face, thorns tearing at her habit. The woman beside her stumbled, fell, stood again. Mercy pulled her along, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. Behind them, the convent glowed red like the mouth of hell. She ran until her legs gave out. They collapsed beneath a black pine tree. Mercy's robes were scorched. Blood oozed from a gash on her calf. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She knew she wouldn't make it far, but she still had the small notebook she'd stolen from Apollonia's office, full of names, dates, and the code that classified the procedures. She tore out the final page and wrote, "If you're reading this, then I failed. But know that what was done inside that place was not faith. It was annihilation disguised as obedience. They carved out voices, identities, entire souls, and called it cleansing. They erased women who once sang, wrote, danced, loved, all in the name of silence. I lit the fire. I freed one. I couldn't save them all, but someone must remember. My name was Sister Mercy Duval. Don't let them take that from me, too." She folded the note, placed it inside the hollow of the pine, wrapped it in her sash, and then she vanished. Some say she died in the woods. Others believe she reached the coast, changed her name, and lived in exile, warning anyone who would listen. But the Vatican never acknowledged the fire. The convent's records list the blaze as an accident. No deaths, no escapes. St. Cecilia's was sealed a week later, and the land was blessed and forgotten. But beneath a black pine tree near the eastern woods, if you dig deep enough, you might still find a scorched sash wrapped around a letter. The ink faded, but the name still legible. Mercy. They didn't hold a funeral for St. Cecilia's. No procession, no bells, no black veils fluttering in the wind. Just a simple decree stamped in Rome. Clausura immediata. Immediate closure. It came without warning. On May 3, 1904, a Vatican official, Monsignor Alvise Romano, arrived by carriage under the cover of dusk. He brought with him a sealed satchel, 3 armed escorts, and a letter bearing the papal insignia. By morning, the convent's gates were locked, the chapel stripped of its relics, and every remaining sister placed onto covered wagons. Where they went, no one could say. Not even the priest who had baptized most of them. The official reason was structural instability, but no one in the nearby village believed that. They had seen the fire a year before, heard the rumors, noticed the girls who never came back, heard the bell tolling at odd hours, and they knew the Vatican didn't send soldiers for crumbling stone. Father Callahan, the village priest, dared to ask Monsignor Romano for a formal explanation. He was told simply, "There are matters above your station, Father." By noon, the wagons had vanished. The convent stood silent, but not empty. Within the week, rumors spread that the bell still rang once each night, even with no hands to pull the rope. That the chapel windows glowed, even though the candles had been removed. And that a scream, faint but unmistakably human, echoed from the east wing on windless nights. The Vatican said nothing. No news reached the papers. No names were released. Not a single death certificate was filed. The bishop of the region, who had signed off on the original founding of St. Cecilia's, was quietly transferred to Argentina. But someone noticed. A Jesuit scholar named Father Matthias Elric had long been suspicious of the convent's practices. He had heard whispers, too many to ignore. Anomalous transfer requests, dozens of women stripped of canonical status without trial, sudden deaths among clergy who asked too many questions. When the fire broke out in 1903, Elric began compiling what he could. Village testimony, fragmented baptismal records, and, most importantly, a letter slipped under his door one winter morning. It was unsigned. The handwriting was hurried, the parchment scorched at the edges. But the final line chilled him to his bones. "They're turning souls into silence. I lit the fire, but I'm not the last." Inside, the letter was a pressed sprig of rosemary, the convent's emblem for remembrance, and a second note with only 2 words, Saint Dymphna. He knew then it was from her, from Sister Mercy, and it became his mission to expose what had happened. He traveled to the ruins in secret in August 1904. What he found was ash and ice. The halls were blackened, the chapel gutted, and the garden overgrown with vines that seemed to strangle the very soil. But hidden beneath the statue of Saint Dymphna, just as the note had hinted, he found it. A hollow compartment, nailed shut. Inside were scraps, documents half burned, pages of surgical logs, ledgers of names, most crossed out, letters, a rosary stained with blood. He gathered what he could and fled before the guards, still stationed on rotation, spotted him. He returned to Rome that autumn with a dossier. He presented it to his superior, Father Luca Barreto, a member of the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life. Barreto read it, slowly, quietly, then stood, walked to the fireplace, and fed the entire folder to the flames. "You're a good priest, Father Elric," he said. "Don't lose your vocation chasing shadows." "But these aren't shadows," Elric replied. "They're women, hundreds of them." Barreto said nothing. 3 days later, Elric was transferred to a Jesuit school in Cairo, without explanation, without appeal. His access to Vatican archives was revoked. His letters were intercepted. And though he tried year after year to reach journalists to publish his findings, doors slammed shut wherever he knocked. By 1906, he had given up. He kept one thing, though, Mercy's original letter. He carried it in his Bible until his death in 1931. Today, it sits in the private collection of an anonymous donor, buried deep in the archives of a Jesuit university in Boston. It's mislabeled, filed under fictional accounts of religious folklore. The Vatican, to this day, has never reopened the case. No investigation, no memorial, no acknowledgement. St. Cecilia's convent remains sealed. Locals won't go near it. The iron gates are rusted, but they hold. The bell tower leans slightly, casting long shadows over the chapel ruins at dusk. And every few years, someone dares to enter. A historian, a student, a thrill-seeker. Most return, a few don't, and the story fades again, just enough for the silence to swallow it. But in the village, if you ask the oldest residents, they'll still tell you, 12 nuns entered. No bodies, no records, no explanation, just a name whispered on stormy nights. Mercy. The package arrived without a return address. It was a gray morning in November 1932 when a clerk at St. Ignatius Archives in Boston found it resting on the marble steps, sealed with black wax stamped in an unfamiliar crest, 2 crossed bones beneath a chalice. No note, no postage. The box itself was heavy, wrapped in oilcloth, and smelled faintly of cedar and something older, something like dust that had never seen light. Inside was a single object, a worn, leather-bound ledger. The edges were singed, the spine frayed. Tucked inside the cover in careful cursive were 5 words: property of Sister Mercy Duval. The clerk, curious, opened it and froze. Page after page he saw names, dates, margins filled with precise Latin phrases. Memoria redacta, corpus sostenere, procedura 223. Each entry contained the full name of a woman, her date of arrival at St. Cecilia's, and the exact nature of her treatment. Some were marked as unfit for procedure, silenced. Others were listed as successful, though notes in red ink often added chilling clarifications. No eye contact, docile but wetting self, response to bell, not to name. There were over 100 entries, and then the ledger shifted. Midway through, the handwriting changed. Smaller, faster. The ink darker, as if written by candlelight. It was a journal, the first line, "I don't know how long I have. I don't even know if I'm still entirely myself. But I must finish this. Someone has to remember their names." Sister Mercy had survived, or at least long enough to write this. Her voice was still sharp, but it trembled. She detailed the fire, the escape, the woods, the woman she saved, the ones she couldn't. She described burying this very ledger beneath the roots of a pine tree near the convent's eastern wall, deep enough to avoid Vatican search teams. She explained how she retrieved it years later, when the search had ended and silence had returned. Then came the most important part. "I know now what they were doing. It was never just obedience, it was experimentation. Mapping the soul like a brain, trying to isolate sin from memory. They weren't cleansing, they were editing." She mentioned diagrams, charts, even receipts, notes smuggled from Rome that proved universities had paid for anonymized case studies. Names changed, procedures cloaked in science. The church, she wrote, had washed its hands while new institutions took up the knife. On the final pages, she described a code she embedded in the earlier entries. Shorthand meant to survive translation. Dates of departure aligned with missing persons reports from towns across Europe. Some subjects had been transferred, not silenced. She believed a network had formed. And then, a warning. If you're reading this, they haven't stopped. They've only changed uniforms. The same tools, the same logic. The chapel became a clinic. The crucifix a clipboard. They renamed the rituals. But the cutting never ended. Taped to the inside of the back cover was a black and white photograph. creased from age. It showed the exterior of a modern mental hospital. On the sign outside, Rose Hill Neurological Institute, Connecticut. And standing just inside the main gate, face blurred but unmistakably familiar, was a woman. Tall, severe, dressed in a nurse's uniform, a small scar visible just beneath her left eye. The archivist flipped back through the ledger. There it was, Apollonia B. Reassigned, 1904. Final result, retained autonomy, high function, retained surgical proficiency. There had been no death record, no transfer listed. She had survived and changed her name. The clerk brought the ledger to his supervisor. By morning, it was gone. Archived, they said, reclassified. Today, no one knows where the original book is stored. Some believe it was taken back to Rome. Others claim it was purchased by a private collector. But rumors persist. Nurses at Rose Hill report unexplained entries in old logbooks, patients without histories, therapies no one remembers authorizing. And in the oldest wing of the hospital, there's a door labeled West Records Restricted. No one has the key, but on quiet nights, staff swear they hear a sound from behind it. Not crying, not screaming, just humming. A fragment of Ave Maria, stopping and starting again, like a woman remembering how to pray, or forgetting she ever knew how. Somewhere, a new ledger is being written. And if you ever find it, read every name out loud, so they are never forgotten again.